He sold one painting during his entire life. One. And he died thinking he'd failed completely. But here's what actually happened in the decade he spent making art that would eventually sell for hundreds of millions of dollars. March 30th, 1853. A village in the southern Netherlands, so small most people couldn't find it on a map. The local pastor and his wife had their first child, a boy they named Vincent van Gogh. Exactly 1 year earlier, to the day, they'd buried another son with the same name. The first Vincent van Gogh never took a breath. This second Vincent would grow up walking past his own name carved into a gravestone every time he went to church. Think about that for a moment. Your entire childhood shaped by the knowledge that you're the replacement, that somewhere in your parents' hearts there's always a comparison happening, a shadow version of you that never got the chance to disappoint anyone. The Van Gogh family wasn't poor, but they weren't wealthy either. Vincent's father, Theodorus, earned a modest salary as a Protestant minister. His mother, Anna, came from a family that had made their money binding books. They lived in a small parsonage next to the church, and eventually there would be 6 children total, though Vincent was always slightly apart from the rest. He was a strange child, quiet for days, then explosive, affectionate one moment, withdrawn the next. The kind of kid who would disappear for hours into the countryside around Zundert, collecting beetles and bird nests, sketching things he saw. His younger brother Theo was born when Vincent was 4, and something clicked between them that would last their entire lives. Every other relationship Vincent had would eventually fracture and fail. But Theo stayed. School didn't work. Vincent attended the village school until he was 11, but he was odd, difficult, intense in ways that made other children uncomfortable. His parents sent him to boarding school in Zevenbergen, 15 miles away. He hated it. 2 years later, they tried again with a different school in Tilburg. He lasted 18 months before they gave up and brought him home. At 16, his formal education was finished. Now what? His family had connections in the arts world through his uncle Sent, who was a partner in the international art dealing firm Goupil and Sier. In July 1869, 3 months after Vincent turned 16, Uncle Sent arranged for him to start working at Goupil's branch in The Hague. And for a while, improbably, it worked. Vincent was good at the job. He learned quickly, developed an eye for what sold, impressed his managers enough that after 4 years they transferred him to their London branch. This was supposed to be a promotion, a sign that young Vincent van Gogh had found his path. He moved to London in 1873, 20 years old, making decent money, living in a boarding house, selling art to wealthy English collectors. But something was happening inside him. He fell in love with his landlady's daughter, Eugenie Lawyer, completely, obsessively in love in the way that only someone who's never learned healthy emotional boundaries can manage. He proposed. She turned him down. She was already secretly engaged to someone else. The rejection shattered something. Vincent spiraled. He stopped caring about his work, started showing up to the gallery dishevelled and distracted. He'd gotten intensely religious, reading the Bible constantly, attending multiple church services, telling wealthy customers that they were corrupting themselves with material possessions. Goupil transferred him to Paris, hoping a change would help. It didn't. He argued with clients, skipped work, made himself impossible to employ. In March 1876, they fired him. He was 23 years old and suddenly adrift. What followed was a cascade of failed attempts to find something, anything, that would give his life meaning. He went back to England and took a job as a teacher in a boarding school, working for room and board with no salary. The headmaster was a Methodist minister, and Vincent became fixated on the idea of becoming a preacher himself. He moved between teaching positions, barely surviving, sleeping in cheap rooms, eating almost nothing. His parents were worried. They brought him back to the Netherlands and used their connections to get him a job at a bookstore in Dordrecht. Vincent lasted 4 months. He spent all his time reading the Bible instead of helping customers. The pattern was becoming clear. Vincent couldn't hold a job because he couldn't compromise. Whatever he was doing, he had to do it with complete, consuming intensity. And if something else captured his attention, everything else ceased to exist. He decided he needed formal religious training. At 24, he went to Amsterdam to study theology, staying with his uncle Jan. He threw himself into learning Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. For 15 months he studied, but he couldn't pass the entrance exam for theology school. The academic requirements were too much. Vincent had passion but not discipline, feeling but not structure. There was one more option. In the south of Belgium, there was a training school for missionaries that didn't require academic credentials. They accepted Vincent in 1878, planning to send him to work among coal miners in the Borinage region, one of the poorest, most brutal places in Europe. The conditions in the mines were medieval. Men descended into pits so narrow they had to crawl, breathing air thick with coal dust, risking death every day for wages that barely kept their families from starving. Vincent went there and tried to live like Christ. He gave away his possessions. He slept on the floor of a shack. He tended to sick miners, visited their families, held prayer meetings. He was doing exactly what his faith told him to do, embracing poverty and service completely. The church authorities were horrified. This wasn't what they wanted. They wanted someone who would bring dignity and order to the mission, not someone who'd sink into the poverty alongside the miners. After 6 months, they dismissed him. Even the church didn't want Vincent's version of Christianity. He was 26 years old. He'd failed as an art dealer, as a teacher, as a theology student, as a missionary. He had no money, no prospects, no clear path forward. He wandered around the Borinage, sleeping in miners' huts, drawing sketches of the people he met. He was completely lost, but something was changing. The drawings were getting better, more confident, more alive. In August 1880, Vincent wrote a letter to Theo that marks the real beginning of his story. He'd decided to become an artist, not as a hobby or a pastime, but as his life's work. He was going to teach himself to draw and paint, and somehow, someway, he was going to make it work. Theo was living in Paris by then, working for Goupil himself. He'd become a successful art dealer, everything Vincent had failed to be. And when Vincent wrote to him announcing this new plan, this impossible dream of becoming an artist with no training at 27 years old, Theo did something extraordinary. He said yes. He would support Vincent financially while he learned. He would send money every month so his older brother could chase this obsession. Vincent moved to Brussels and started studying in earnest. He bought instruction manuals. He copied prints and drawings. He studied anatomy and perspective. The work was hard, progress was slow, but for the first time in his adult life, Vincent had found something that held his attention without destroying him in the process. He drew peasants and miners. He drew landscapes. He drew constantly, filling sketchbook after sketchbook. In 1881, he moved back to his parents' house in Etten. His father had taken a new position, and Vincent set up a small studio there. He was drawing better now, starting to develop his own style, but being back with his family brought all the old tensions to the surface. Vincent fell in love again, this time with his recently widowed cousin, Kie Vos. She came to visit with her young son, and Vincent became convinced they were meant for each other. She wasn't interested, not even a little. When he pressed her, she told him clearly, "No, never, absolutely not." Vincent didn't accept this. He followed her to Amsterdam, showed up at her parents' house, demanded to see her. When they refused, he held his hand over a lamp flame and told them he'd keep it there until they let him speak to her. They blew out the lamp. The incident terrified his family. Vincent was becoming impossible to be around, swinging between manic energy and deep depression, fixated on ideas that made no sense to anyone else. His father told him to leave. On Christmas Day, 1881, they had a final argument and Vincent walked out. He was 28 years old and he'd burned another bridge. He went to The Hague and convinced a distant relative, Anton Mauve, to give him painting lessons. Mauve was an established artist, part of the Hague School, and for a few months Vincent finally had proper instruction. He learned to work with oil paints. He studied colour and composition. But then Vincent met a pregnant prostitute named Sian Hornick and decided to move in with her and her young daughter. Mauve stopped the lessons. Vincent's family was appalled. Theo kept sending money, but he begged Vincent to leave Sian to stop making choices that isolated him from everyone who wanted to help. Vincent refused. He lived with Sian and her children for over a year, painting her, drawing her, trying to create some kind of family from this wreckage. It couldn't last. Sian went back to prostitution. The arrangement fell apart. In September 1883, Vincent left The Hague and headed to Drenthe, a remote province in the northeastern Netherlands. He was alone again, 30 years old, living on Theo's charity, making art that no one wanted to buy. The landscape in Drenthe was harsh and beautiful, flat moorland stretching to the horizon, peat bogs, scattered farms. Vincent painted it obsessively, working outside in all weather. But the isolation was crushing. After 3 months, he gave up and went back to his parents one more time. They'd moved to Nuenen, a small village in the south, and Vincent set up a studio in a room next to the parsonage. This time, something shifted. Vincent settled into a routine. He painted the peasants and weavers of Nuenen. He studied colour theory. He worked on his technique. The paintings from this period are dark, earthy, serious. He was finding his voice slowly. In 1885, he completed his first major work, The Potato Eaters. It shows a peasant family gathered around a small table in a dim room, eating potatoes by lamplight. The faces are rough, almost ugly. The colours are muddy browns and dark greens. It's not pretty, but it's powerful. Vincent believed he'd created something important, something that captured the dignity and hardship of peasant life. The critics hated it. The few people who saw it thought the figures were crudely drawn, the composition awkward. Vincent's father died suddenly that same year, and the family blamed Vincent's stress and difficulty for contributing to his death. His mother moved away. Vincent stayed in the studio, painting alone. By November 1885, Vincent had had enough of the Netherlands. He needed to see real art, to study the masters, to be somewhere that took painting seriously. He left for Antwerp, Belgium, found a small room above a paint dealer's shop, and enrolled in the Academy of Fine Arts. The academy was a disaster. Vincent was older than the other students, already set in his methods, unwilling to follow instruction he disagreed with. He argued with teachers, ignored assignments, painted what he wanted instead of what was required. He lasted 3 months before essentially dropping out. But something else happened in Antwerp. Vincent discovered Japanese prints. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints were flooding into Europe, and Vincent became obsessed with their bold outlines, flat colours, unusual compositions. He bought dozens of them, pinned them to his studio walls, studied them constantly. They would change how he painted. And then in late February 1886, Vincent made a decision that would alter everything. He was going to Paris. Theo was there, working successfully for Goupil. Paris was the centre of the art world, where the impressionists were shocking audiences, and new movements were emerging every few years. Vincent needed to be there. He needed to see what was happening, to learn from it, to find his place in it. He didn't ask Theo if he could come. He just showed up. One day, in early March, Theo received a note at the gallery. "Don't be angry with me for arriving without warning. I've thought about it so much, and I believe we'll save time this way." Vincent van Gogh had arrived in Paris. He was 33 years old. He'd been seriously painting for less than 6 years. He had no idea that he had exactly 4 years left to create the work that would make him immortal. But first, he had to survive the city that would transform him completely. Paris hit Vincent like a wall of colour. The city was bigger, louder, more chaotic than anything he'd experienced. The streets teemed with people, Cafes spilled onto sidewalks, galleries lined entire boulevards. And the light was different here. Softer, hazier, filtered through industrial smoke and river mist. It made everything glow. Theo's apartment on Rue Laval was small, meant for one person. Now there were two. Vincent moved into a tiny room, barely large enough for a bed and easel. The brothers shared meals, shared space, shared air. It was cramped and uncomfortable. Theo, meticulous and organised, found himself living with a tornado. Vincent tracked paint everywhere. He left sketches scattered on furniture. He worked at odd hours, pacing, muttering to himself. The apartment smelled constantly of turpentine and tobacco, but Theo didn't complain. He'd made a promise years ago to support his brother's art. He kept it. Vincent threw himself into Paris with manic energy. He visited the Louvre constantly, studying the old masters for hours. He walked through galleries, seeing work by artists he'd only read about, and he discovered something that shocked him completely. His dark Dutch paintings looked ancient here. Everything in Paris was bright. The impressionists had blown open the doors of what painting could be. Claude Monet was painting haystacks in blazing sunlight. Pierre-Auguste Renoir was capturing dancers in dappled outdoor light. Camille Pissarro was rendering entire landscapes in visible brushstrokes of pure colour. These painters had abandoned the dark interiors and muddy palettes of traditional art. They painted what the eye actually saw in natural light, colours that shimmered, shifted, broke apart into component hues. Vincent realised immediately that everything he'd done before was wrong. Not bad, just obsolete. He needed to start over. He enrolled at the studio of Fernand Cormon, a respected academic painter who ran one of Paris's more progressive ateliers. The studio attracted serious students, including several who had become significant artists. Here, Vincent met Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, an aristocrat turned bohemian who painted the cabarets and brothels of Montmartre. He met Émile Bernard, young and experimental. He met John Peter Russell, an Australian who would later teach Monet about colour. These weren't the provincial Dutch painters Vincent had known. These were artists pushing boundaries, arguing about theory, trying to invent new ways of seeing. The conversations were fierce. Everyone had opinions about what art should be, what it should do, where it was going. Vincent absorbed everything. He watched how the Impressionists worked. He studied their broken brushwork, their high-key palettes, their practice of painting outdoors directly from nature. He started experimenting with lighter colours. His paintings began to change. The muddy browns and dark greens of his Dutch period gave way to yellows, pinks, light blues. His brushwork loosened. The paintings started breathing. But the transition wasn't smooth. Vincent's temperament didn't match the Impressionist aesthetic. They painted leisure, picnics, regattas, dances, pleasant afternoons. Vincent painted workers, worn faces, the grind of daily survival. He couldn't paint pretty things prettily. Even when he tried to adopt their techniques, something harder, more urgent came through. Theo introduced Vincent to the network of art dealers and collectors he knew through Goupil. Vincent met Julien Tanguy, a paint seller who let poor artists pay for supplies with paintings. Père Tanguy, as everyone called him, had walls covered with work by unknown artists. His shop became a gathering place, somewhere painters could see each other's work, argue, commiserate. Vincent spent hours there. Through these circles, Vincent encountered the work of Georges Seurat. Seurat had taken Impressionism to its logical extreme. He painted in tiny dots of pure colour, relying on the viewer's eye to mix them optically. His enormous canvas, A Sunday Afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte, was creating sensation and controversy. Vincent was fascinated but sceptical. The method seemed too scientific, too calculated. Painting for him was about emotion, instinct, urgency. The neo-impressionists, as Seurat's followers called themselves, had their own theories. They'd studied colour science, optical physics, contemporary research into how eyes perceive hue and light. They believed painting could be systematic, almost mathematical. Vincent respected the ambition, but couldn't work that way. His paintings needed to come out fast, direct, raw. What he did take from them was a new understanding of colour relationships. He learned that complementary colours, red and green, yellow and purple, blue and orange, intensified each other when placed side by side. He learned that shadows weren't black or brown, but contained colours reflected from surrounding objects. He learned that light itself had colour, changed throughout the day, affected everything it touched. His palette transformed completely. He started painting flowers, sunflowers, irises, roses. The Dutch Vincent would never have chosen such subjects. But now he was experimenting with colour for its own sake, trying to capture not just what things looked like, but how they felt. The self-portraits began during this period. Vincent painted himself obsessively, dozens of times in different lights, different moods, different styles. It was partly practical. Models cost money he didn't have, but it was also something deeper. He was trying to figure out who he was becoming. Theo watched all this with mixed feelings. He was proud of Vincent's development, excited by the new work, but he was also exhausted. Living with Vincent meant constant intensity. There was no relaxation, no quiet evenings. Vincent wanted to talk about art all night, every night. He needed constant reassurance, constant engagement, and he was expensive. Theo paid for everything: rent, food, art supplies, clothes. The financial strain was becoming serious. Vincent knew he was a burden. It tormented him. He kept promising that soon his work would sell, that he'd pay Theo back for everything. But nothing sold. The few dealers who looked at his work found it strange, unfinished, too aggressive. Collectors wanted pleasant paintings for their dining rooms. Vincent's work was not pleasant. The drinking got worse in Paris. Vincent had always used alcohol to steady his nerves, but now it became heavier. Absinthe, mostly. The green liquor that half of artistic Paris seemed addicted to. It helped him sleep, helped quiet the constant noise in his head, but it also made him erratic, prone to outbursts. Friends began to worry. By early 1887, Vincent had been in Paris a year. The city was wearing him down. Too many people, too much noise, too much competition for attention. His health was suffering. He'd always been thin, but now he looked gaunt. He had stomach problems, likely from poor diet and too much alcohol. His teeth were rotting. He was 34 and looked 50, but the paintings were getting better, undeniably better. He'd learned so much in such a short time. The dark Dutch painter had become someone else entirely. His canvases now exploded with colour. His brushwork had loosened into something distinctive, energetic, alive. You could see the hand moving across the canvas, making decisions, responding to what was emerging. He painted views of Montmartre, the neighbourhood where he and Theo had moved. He painted the gardens at Montmartre, the windmills, the cafes, the working-class streets. He painted the bridges over the Seine, boats on the river, the outskirts of the city where factories met fields. He was documenting Paris the way he'd documented the peasants of Nouenen, finding beauty in ordinary places, in work and daily life. The Japanese prints continued to obstinate him. He organised an exhibition of them at a small cafe, trying to share his enthusiasm with other artists. The show didn't generate much interest, but Vincent didn't care. He kept studying the prints, kept trying to capture something of their boldness in his own work. He painted a portrait of Père Tanguy, the kind paint seller, surrounding him with Japanese prints on the wall behind. It's a remarkable painting. Tanguy's gentle face emerging from a riot of colour and pattern. Vincent was synthesising everything he'd learned: impressionist light, complementary colours, Japanese composition, into something that was finally, distinctly his own. But Paris was killing him. The pace, the pressure, the constant stimulation. He needed quiet. He needed space. He needed to work without the weight of the entire art world looking over his shoulder, judging, dismissing, ignoring. In February 1888, Vincent saw a magazine article about Provence, the region in southern France, known for its intense light and colour. The writer described it as having the clarity of Japan, the brightness that Japanese artists captured in their prints. Something in Vincent's mind clicked. He needed to go there. He needed to see if that light could help him paint the way he was starting to imagine. Theo was relieved when Vincent announced he was leaving Paris. He loved his brother, but 2 years of living together had strained them both nearly to breaking. The apartment had become a pressure cooker. Some distance would help. Theo agreed to keep sending money, to keep supporting Vincent's work. He'd send 150 francs a month, enough to live modestly in the south. Vincent spent his last weeks in Paris painting frantically, as if trying to capture everything before leaving. He did a series of restaurants, interiors glowing with gaslight and colour. He painted more self-portraits, documenting the face that was about to begin the most productive year of his life. On February 20th, 1888, Vincent boarded a train heading south. He carried his easel, his paints, a few clothes, and almost no money. He'd never been to Provence. He had no connections there, no place to stay. He was going entirely on instinct, following a hunch that the light would be different, that something important waited for him there. The train travelled through the night. Vincent watched the darkness through the window, occasionally seeing lights from distant farms. He was leaving behind everything he'd learned in Paris, but he was also escaping the weight of it. In the south, no one would know who he was. He could work without the pressure of the Paris art world, without comparing himself constantly to Monet and Seurat and everyone else. He was going to make his breakthrough. He was certain of it. The light in Provence would be the key. He'd paint like the Japanese masters, capturing nature with bold colours and simple forms. He'd create a body of work that would finally make people understand what he was trying to do. The train pulled into Arles at 8 in the morning. Vincent stepped onto the platform into brilliant sunshine. Snow covered the ground, unusual for Provence, but even through the cold, the light was different. Clearer, sharper, more intense than anything he'd seen before. He found a cheap hotel, dropped his bags, and went looking for subjects to paint. Within hours, he'd begun sketching. Within days, he'd completed his first Arles canvas, a landscape with snow, painted in colours so bright they seemed impossible. Vincent van Gogh had arrived in the place where he would create the paintings that would make him immortal. He had 15 months left before his first complete mental collapse, 14 months before he'd mutilate his own ear, 16 months before he'd voluntarily commit himself to an asylum. But he didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was the light, the incredible, impossible light, and he couldn't wait to capture it. Arles in February was not what Vincent had expected. The snow melted within days, revealing a town of narrow streets and Roman ruins, of cafes and brothels, of working people who had no idea what impressionism was and wouldn't have cared if they did. It was perfect. He found a room at the hotel restaurant Carol, 2 francs a night, meals included. The proprietor was a short, round woman who looked at this strange Dutchman with suspicion, but took his money. Vincent set up his easel in the room and began working immediately. The light, even in winter, was extraordinary. It had a quality he'd never encountered before, a crystalline clarity that made colours sing. In Paris, the light was soft, diffused by moisture and smoke. Here it was sharp, direct, almost aggressive. It carved shadows with clean edges. It made ordinary objects look sculptural. He painted orchards. The fruit trees around Arles were beginning to bloom, and Vincent became obsessed with capturing them. Pink blossoms against blue sky, white petals scattered on green grass. He worked quickly, trying to get the colour down before the light changed. Sometimes he finished a painting in a single session, standing at his easel for hours without rest. His technique from Paris had been about careful brushstrokes, about building up layers. Now he was painting more directly, applying thick paint straight from the tube, letting the texture create energy on the canvas. The surface of his paintings became more physical, more immediate. He wrote to Theo constantly, letters filled with excitement about the light, about the colours he was discovering, about his plans for the future. He was spending money too quickly. The 150 francs Theo sent each month should have been enough, but Vincent was buying paints and canvases, paying for models, eating in cafes. By the end of March, he was already asking for more. Theo sent what he could, but he had his own expenses. He was planning to marry Jo Bonger, a Dutch woman he'd been courting for years. The wedding would cost money. Vincent's constant financial demands were becoming a burden. But Vincent couldn't stop working. He'd found something here, a way of seeing that felt completely his own. The Japanese prints he'd studied in Paris had shown him that nature could be simplified, that trees didn't need to look exactly like trees, as long as the essential feeling was there. In Arles, he began applying this insight with increasing confidence. His orchard paintings were studies in bold simplification: blue sky, pink blossoms, green grass, simple shapes, intense colours, thick paint. Nothing subtle about them. They looked nothing like the careful impressionist landscapes that Paris collectors preferred. They looked like Vincent van Gogh. He painted the Langlois Bridge, a drawbridge outside town that reminded him of Holland. Yellow Bridge, blue sky, women washing clothes in the canal below. He painted it multiple times, trying different colour combinations, different times of day. In one version, the sky's pale blue, and the grass is emerald green. In another, the sky's deep cobalt, and the grass is yellow-green. He was experimenting, pushing colour further than he'd ever dared before. The people of Arles didn't know what to make of him. He walked through town with his easel and paints, his clothes spattered with colour, his red beard unkempt. He spoke French with a thick Dutch accent. He drank too much in the cafes, talked too loud about art and Japan and colour theory. The locals called him Le Fou Rou, the red-haired madman. Children followed him sometimes, laughing at the strange man who painted such bizarre pictures. Vincent didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt productive. He was painting constantly, finishing canvases at an incredible rate. 20 paintings in March, more in April. He couldn't work fast enough to capture everything he wanted to paint. The spring landscape was exploding with colour, and he felt like he was finally painting the way he'd always known he should. But working this intensely came at a cost. He barely ate. He spent his food money on paints. When Theo's monthly payment arrived, Vincent would immediately buy supplies, then realise he had nothing left for meals. He'd go days eating only bread and coffee, working until exhaustion forced him to stop. His health, never robust, began to deteriorate. His teeth were rotting. His stomach troubled him constantly. He had episodes of dizziness, moments where the world seemed to tilt and blur. He ignored all of it. The work was what mattered. In April, he moved out of the hotel. 2 francs a night was too expensive. He found a small yellow house on the Place Lamartine, 4 rooms that he could rent for 15 francs a month. It was empty, no furniture, but it had good light. He could set up a studio on the ground floor and sleep upstairs. More importantly, he could invite other artists to join him. This was Vincent's new dream. He would create an artists' colony in the south, a community where painters could work together, share ideas, support each other. The Japanese artists had worked this way, learning from each other, improving together. Why couldn't European artists do the same? He wrote to Theo about the plan. He wrote to Gauguin, to Bernard, to other painters he'd met in Paris. Come south. The light is incredible. We can work together. We can create something new. Most ignored him. They had their own lives, their own plans. But Paul Gauguin, struggling with poverty in Brittany, was interested. Maybe. If Theo could send money for the train fare, if Vincent could furnish the yellow house properly, if the arrangement made sense financially. Vincent threw himself into preparing the house. He bought 2 beds, 12 chairs, a table. He hung his own paintings on the walls, decorating the space with the work he'd completed since arriving. The bedroom upstairs became his pride. He painted it specifically to show what the house could be: a simple room with a wooden bed, 2 chairs, a small table, paintings on the walls. The colours were intense: yellow walls, red blanket, green window shutters, everything simplified to its essential colour. He painted this bedroom multiple times, obsessing over getting the colours right. The summer heat arrived, and with it, a new subject. Vincent began painting the wheat fields surrounding Arles. These weren't the gentle pastoral scenes that French landscape painters favoured. These were fields under a sun so intense it felt hostile. Yellow wheat, blue sky, heat radiating from every brushstroke. He painted harvesters working in the fields, their bodies bent under the weight of the labour. He painted the sun itself, a yellow disk hanging in a pale sky, so bright it hurt to look at. His technique was evolving rapidly. The paint got thicker, the brushstrokes more aggressive. He'd apply colour in short, violent dabs, building up texture that made the canvas surface almost sculptural. In some paintings, the paint stood out from the canvas by nearly 1/4 inch. This wasn't how oil painting was supposed to work. You were supposed to blend, to create smooth transitions, to hide the brush strokes. Vincent did the opposite. He wanted you to see every mark, to feel the energy of the painting's creation. In June, he painted the harvest, the moment when the wheat was cut and gathered. These paintings vibrate with intensity. The fields are rendered in yellows and oranges, so bright they seem to generate their own light. The skies are harsh, unforgiving blue. Everything is simplified to patches of pure colour, the way Japanese prints simplified nature. But there's nothing calm about these paintings. They're violent, aggressive, almost frightening in their intensity. He sent some to Theo, who showed them to other dealers. The response was disappointing. Too crude, too rough. The colours were garish. The technique was unfinished. These weren't paintings that could be sold to respectable collectors. They were the work of someone who didn't understand how art was supposed to look. Theo tried to be encouraging in his letters, but Vincent could read between the lines. His work wasn't succeeding commercially. He was now 35 years old, had been painting seriously for 8 years, and had sold exactly 1 painting in his entire life. Red Vineyard at Arles would sell for 400 francs to Anna Bock, sister of his friend Eugene. 1 painting, 400 francs in 8 years. The failure ate at him. He worked harder, painted more, as if quantity could somehow compensate for the lack of recognition. By August, he'd completed dozens of new canvases. Sunflowers became his obsession. He painted them in various stages, from fresh blooms to dying flowers, all arranged in simple vases against flat backgrounds. The yellow of the flowers against yellow walls created an almost monochromatic effect. Different shades of the same colour, vibrating against each other. These sunflower paintings were Vincent's attempt to create something undeniably beautiful, something even critics couldn't dismiss as crude or unfinished. He wanted to prove he could paint skillfully, when he chose to, that his rough technique was intentional, not a failure of ability. He lavished attention on these flowers, painting them with a care and precision he rarely showed. The petals were rendered with delicate brushstrokes. The vases were modelled with subtle gradations of tone. These were paintings meant to impress, to silence the critics who said he couldn't really paint. But even as he worked on these more careful pieces, his true energy went into paintings that were wilder, more experimental. The Night Cafe, painted in early September, was an attempt to capture the atmosphere of a place he frequented, a cheap establishment where prostitutes and drunks gathered. He painted it in colours that were meant to express the terrible passions of humanity. Red walls, green ceiling, yellow floor, figures slumped at tables. The perspective was deliberately distorted. The the walls seeming to press in on the viewer. He wanted the painting to feel claustrophobic, oppressive, like the place itself. This was Vincent's breakthrough moment, though he didn't fully recognize it. He was beginning to use colour emotionally rather than descriptively. The cafe walls weren't actually that shade of red. The ceiling wasn't that green, but these colours expressed what the place felt like, the depression and desperation that hung in the air. He was painting psychology rather than reality. It was a radical approach, and it would influence painters for generations. But in September 1888, it was just Vincent trying to capture something he felt, but couldn't quite articulate. Gauguin finally agreed to come. Theo had offered to pay him 150 francs a month, the same amount he sent Vincent in exchange for one painting per month. It was a good deal for Gauguin, who was broke and running out of options. He'd arrive in late October. Vincent spent September frantically preparing, painting more sunflowers to decorate Gauguin's bedroom, finishing work on the yellow house, trying to make everything perfect for his guest. This was his chance to prove the artist's colony could work. If he and Gauguin could collaborate successfully, others might join them. They could build something lasting, something important. He painted his bedroom again, getting the colours exactly right. Yellow walls, red blanket, blue window, simple furniture, simple composition, but the colours were singing. This was what he wanted Gauguin to see when he arrived. Not the poverty, not the struggles, but the possibility. The way colour could transform a simple room into something transcendent. On October 23rd, 1888, Paul Gauguin stepped off the train in Arles. Vincent was waiting on the platform, nervous and excited. Finally, a fellow artist to work with. Finally, someone who understood what he was trying to do. They walked back to the yellow house together, Vincent talking rapidly about his plans, about the paintings he'd completed, about the work they could do together. Gauguin looked around the house and said nothing. He was appalled by the poverty, by the crude furniture, by the paintings Vincent had hung everywhere like some kind of madman's shrine. But he needed Theo's money. He'd stay for a while, see if it could work. Neither of them knew they had exactly 9 weeks before everything would explode. The first days were tentative. 2 painters circling each other, testing boundaries, trying to understand how this arrangement might work. Gauguin was 40 years old, 10 years Vincent's senior, and he carried himself with the authority of someone who believed he'd figured things out. He'd been a stockbroker, a sailor, a husband and father, before abandoning it all for art. He'd lived in Panama and Martinique. He'd developed theories about painting that he spoke about with absolute confidence. Vincent, eager to please, tried to absorb everything. They established a routine quickly. Mornings in the studio, afternoons painting outdoors or in town, evenings discussing art over dinner that they cooked together. He wasn't very good at it, but Gauguin was worse, and they managed to feed themselves on Vincent's limited budget. The conversations were electric. Finally, Vincent had someone to argue with about colour theory, about composition, about what painting could and should be. Gauguin had strong opinions. He believed painters should work from memory and imagination, not from direct observation. The real world was just raw material to be transformed by the artist's mind. Vincent disagreed. He believed in painting what he saw, in capturing the truth of the moment. But he was willing to listen, to learn, to try Gauguin's methods. They painted the same subjects to compare approaches. The public gardens, the Alice camp's burial ground, the local women. Gauguin's work was flatter, more decorative. The figures simplified into bold shapes and colours. Vincent's was more turbulent, the brushwork visible and energetic. They were fundamentally different painters trying to find common ground. Vincent tried to paint from memory, as Gauguin suggested. It felt wrong, artificial, but he produced some interesting work. A painting of the cafe where they ate, done entirely in the studio from memory. The colours were stranger than in his earlier cafe paintings, the perspective more distorted. It wasn't quite his style, but it showed he was willing to experiment, willing to adapt. Gauguin painted Vincent's portrait. It showed him painting sunflowers, his face in profile, concentrating intensely on his work. Vincent hated it. He thought it made him look insane, which Gauguin probably intended. The painting captured something Vincent didn't want acknowledged, the barely controlled intensity that drove him, the sense that he was always on the edge of something. He painted Gauguin in return, working at an easel. It was a more respectful portrait, showing his friend as a serious artist absorbed in creation. Gauguin liked it well enough. They hung both portraits in the yellow house, facing each other like boxers in a ring. The money situation was difficult. Theo sent 150 francs for Vincent and 150 for Gauguin every month, but it wasn't enough for two people. Vincent had managed on his share when living alone, barely, but adding another person doubled expenses. Food, wine, tobacco, painting supplies, everything cost more. They argued about money constantly. Gauguin thought Vincent was wasteful. Vincent thought Gauguin was demanding. Both were probably right. They visited the local brothel together. Vincent had been going there for years, knew the women, felt comfortable in that world. Gauguin was more calculating about it, treating the visits as transactions rather than relationships. They painted the prostitutes sometimes, Vincent with sympathy, Gauguin with detachment. The difference in their attitudes extended to everything. Vincent felt deeply, sometimes too deeply. Gauguin observed, analysed, kept himself removed. By December, the tension was building. Small irritations accumulated. Gauguin was neater, more organised, and Vincent's chaos drove him crazy. The studio was always a mess, paint tubes everywhere, canvases stacked haphazardly. Gauguin tried to impose order, and Vincent resented it. This was his house, his space, and Gauguin was a guest. Gauguin saw it differently. He was contributing equally, doing his share of work, and deserved equal say in how things were run. They argued about art. Gauguin insisted his approach was superior, that working from imagination produced stronger work than slavish copying of nature. Vincent defended his method passionately. Direct observation, emotional engagement with the subject, the physical act of painting in front of the motif. These things mattered. They weren't just competing philosophies. They were fighting about who they were as artists, as men. Vincent painted furiously during these weeks. He couldn't help himself. When stressed, he worked, and the stress was constant now. He painted the yellow house at night, the stars swirling above it, the windows glowing warm against the dark blue street. He painted the dance hall where they went some evenings, trying to capture the movement and energy of the crowd. The paintings from this period show increasing agitation in the brushwork. The paint applied more thickly, more violently. Gauguin talked about leaving, not seriously at first, just mentioning that Paris might offer better opportunities, that the Yellow House experiment wasn't quite working as planned. Vincent panicked. If Gauguin left, the whole dream collapsed. No other artist would come if the first one fled after 2 months. He'd be alone again, and this time with the added humiliation of failure. He begged Gauguin to stay. They could work it out, make adjustments, find a way forward. Gauguin remained non-committal, which made it worse. December 23rd was a Sunday. They'd been arguing more frequently, about everything and nothing. The house felt too small for two people with such different temperaments. That afternoon they went to a cafe. The details of what happened are unclear, because both men told different versions later, and neither was entirely reliable. What's certain is that Vincent became agitated, possibly threw a glass at Gauguin's head. Gauguin left the cafe, went back to the yellow house, packed his things, and took a room at a hotel. Vincent followed him through the streets, arguing, pleading. Gauguin kept walking. At some point, Gauguin claimed later, Vincent threatened him with a razor. Gauguin stared him down, and Vincent retreated. This part is disputed. Vincent never mentioned it, and Gauguin might have invented or exaggerated the threat to justify what he did next. which was abandoned Vincent entirely. That night, alone in the yellow house, Vincent did something that would define him in the public imagination forever. He took the razor he'd supposedly threatened Gauguin with and cut off part of his own left ear. Not the entire ear, that's a myth. He removed the lower portion of the lobe, a piece about the size of a coin. It bled profusely, as head wounds do, and he wrapped it carefully in newspaper. Then he put on a beret to hide the damage, walked to the brothel he frequented, and handed the wrapped piece of flesh to a woman named Rachel, who worked there, asking her to keep this object carefully. She screamed. He walked home, leaving a trail of blood through the streets. The next morning, the police found him unconscious in his bed, the mattress soaked with blood. They thought he was dead. They took him to the hospital, where a doctor examined the wound and determined he'd survive. The ear was badly damaged, but the mutilation wasn't fatal. Gauguin, hearing about the incident, packed his remaining belongings and left immediately for Paris. He never saw Vincent again. Why did Vincent do it? A century of speculation hasn't produced a definitive answer. Was it guilt over threatening Gauguin? Self-punishment for driving away his only companion? A psychotic break triggered by stress and overwork? An expression of rage turned inward when he couldn't direct it outward? All of these factors probably played a role. Vincent was exhausted, isolated, drinking too much, and putting impossible pressure on himself to make the Yellow House experiment succeed. When it failed, something in him snapped. The people of Arles were horrified. This strange foreign painter, who already made them uncomfortable, had now proven himself dangerous. A madman who mutilated himself and brought bloody pieces of flesh to prostitutes. The newspapers reported the incident with sensational details. The respectable citizens wanted nothing to do with him. He'd gone from eccentric to threatening overnight. Vincent recovered physically within days. The wound healed, though he'd lost part of his ear permanently. Mentally, he was shattered. He knew what he'd done, knew how it looked, knew that his dream of an artist's colony was destroyed completely. Gauguin was gone, and no one else would come now. The Yellow House would remain his alone. Theo rushed to Arles as soon as he heard, frantic with worry. He found his brother lucid, but defeated, sitting in the hospital wrapped in bandages, apologising for the trouble he'd caused. Theo stayed a few days to make sure Vincent was stable, then returned to Paris, leaving his brother to recover alone. Vincent painted a self-portrait, showing himself with his head bandaged, a pipe in his mouth, his expression distant and sad. It's one of his most famous images, the wounded artist confronting his own reflection. The painting is remarkably calm, considering what he'd just been through. The colours are muted, the brushwork controlled. He was painting himself back to sanity, using his work to reconstruct an identity that had temporarily fractured. He did another self-portrait a few weeks later, this one showing the bandaged ear from a different angle, his coat a vivid green against a red background. The colours were bolder now, the confidence returning. He was still himself underneath the damage, still capable of making extraordinary paintings. The ear was gone, but the eye remained, and the hand that held the brush. The people of Arles weren't convinced. In February, a petition circulated demanding that Vincent be removed from the Yellow House. 80 citizens signed it, claiming he was dangerous, that he frightened women and children, that his presence lowered property values. The police, responding to public pressure, evicted him and locked the Yellow House. His paintings, his furniture, everything he owned was sealed inside. He was taken back to the hospital, this time not as a patient recovering from a self-inflicted injury, but as a threat to public order. He stayed there for weeks, allowed to paint in the hospital garden under supervision, but not permitted to return to his home. The humiliation was complete. He'd come to Arles to paint, to create, to build something lasting. Now he was locked away like a criminal, his work inaccessible, his reputation destroyed. The Yellow House stood empty, his paintings hanging on the walls, where no one could see them. All that work, all those sunflowers and starry nights, sealed behind a locked door by frightened townspeople who wanted him gone. In the hospital, Vincent painted whatever he could see. The courtyard, the other patients, the nurses. He painted flowers that people brought to cheer him up. Irises in a vase that he rendered with the same intensity he'd brought to sunflowers. The irises were purple and white against a yellow background, each petal observed carefully, the leaves bending and twisting with life. He couldn't paint outdoors, couldn't access his familiar subjects. So he painted what was in front of him and made it transcendent. Theo visited again in March, increasingly worried. His brother's mental state was fragile, the situation in Arles untenable. Something had to change. Vincent knew it too. He couldn't stay here, couldn't rebuild his reputation after what had happened. The yellow house dream was over. He needed to go somewhere else, somewhere he could paint without persecution, where people understood that artists were different, and that difference wasn't dangerous. He needed, though he hated to admit it, supervision. In May of 1889, Vincent van Gogh walked through the gates of the Saint-Paul-de-Moselle asylum in Saint-Remy de Provence, about 15 miles from Arles. He checked himself in voluntarily. The diagnosis was vague, epilepsy complicated by acute mania, but the real issue was simpler. He couldn't trust himself anymore. The episodes were unpredictable. One moment he'd be painting normally, the next he'd be lost in delusions, unable to distinguish reality from hallucination. He needed to be somewhere safe, somewhere he couldn't hurt himself or frighten others. The asylum had been a monastery once. High walls surrounded the buildings, protecting the patients from the world, and the world from the patients. There were gardens, a fountain, wheat fields visible beyond the walls. It wasn't a prison exactly, more like a sanctuary. Vincent was given a room with barred windows that looked out on the garden. The room next door became his studio. It was more space than he'd had in years. The conditions were better than expected. He could paint whenever he wanted, could walk in the gardens, could even leave the grounds with an attendant if he felt well enough. The other patients left him alone. Most were far sicker than he was, lost in their own worlds, barely aware of his presence. The doctors were skeptical of his painting but didn't forbid it. If making pictures kept him calm, he could make pictures. He started cautiously, painting the view from his window, the wheat field, the mountains in the distance, the olive trees with their twisted trunks and silver leaves. He worked on several canvases simultaneously, moving between them as the light changed, building up layers of paint with quick, decisive strokes. The paintings from this period are extraordinary. The colours are vivid, the forms distorted by the intensity of his vision, everything pulsing with energy. He painted irises growing wild in the garden, purple petals against green stems, each flower distinct yet part of a unified composition. The painting has no horizon line, just flowers pressing forward, demanding attention. It's one of his most famous works now, though at the time it was just another picture from the asylum. He painted the asylum itself, the long corridors, the stone archways, the shadowed spaces where other patients wandered. These paintings are darker, more subdued. The colours are muted, the atmosphere heavy. You can feel the weight of the place, the sadness of being locked away. But even here, Vincent found beauty. The way light fell through a window, the curve of a vaulted ceiling, the texture of old stone walls, everything was worth painting. The wheat fields beyond the walls obsessed him. He could see them from his window, changing with the seasons, green in spring, gold in summer. He painted them over and over, each version different, each one trying to capture something he couldn't quite articulate. The movement of wind through grain, the weight of sunlight on growing things, the sense of life continuing outside the walls while he was trapped inside. In June, just a month after arriving, he had another episode. He was walking in the fields with an attendant when he suddenly collapsed, confused and disoriented. He tried to eat his paints, thinking they were food. The attendant brought him back to the asylum, where he spent days in bed, unable to speak coherently, lost in whatever world his mind had constructed. When he emerged, he had no memory of what had happened. This pattern would repeat throughout his time at Saint-Remy, weeks of productive work interrupted by sudden breakdowns, periods when painting was impossible because he couldn't trust his own perceptions. The episodes usually lasted a few days, sometimes a week. Then he'd recover, exhausted and ashamed, and return to his easel with renewed determination. The uncertainty was torture. He never knew when the next episode would come, whether he'd finish the painting he was working on, whether the person he was today would still exist tomorrow. But between episodes, the work flowed. He painted cypresses, those dark Mediterranean trees that rose like flames against the sky. He'd always loved them, their dramatic shapes, their association with death and mourning. Now he painted them obsessively, making them the central subjects of canvases rather than background elements. The trees twisted and writhed in his paintings, full of turbulent energy, reaching toward heaven or perhaps trying to escape the earth. In July, Theo sent news that Vincent's paintings had been shown at an exhibition in Paris. Not a solo show, just a few works included in a group exhibition, but still people had seen them. A critic had written about them, calling them the work of a true colorist. Vincent was moved by this recognition, but also skeptical. One good review didn't mean anything. He'd been ignored for so long that praise felt suspicious, like it might disappear if he paid too much attention to it. August brought intense heat. The wheat was harvested, leaving the fields bare. Vincent painted the reapers at work, tiny figures against vast expanses of gold. The paintings convey the brutal labour of harvest, the way human beings bend themselves to the rhythms of agriculture. But there's also something transcendent about them, the way the light transforms everything into colour and movement. September was cooler. Vincent requested permission to paint outside the asylum grounds, to venture beyond the walls that had contained him for 4 months. The doctors agreed, allowing him to work in the surrounding countryside with an attendant nearby. He painted olive groves, the ancient trees with their gnarled trunks and delicate leaves. The paintings are turbulent, the ground swirling, the sky pressing down, everything in motion. He was trying to capture not just what he saw, but what he felt, the emotional reality beneath the visible surface. In late September, he received more good news from Theo. An article had appeared in a Paris journal praising his work at length. The critic, Albert Aurea, called Vincent a genius, compared his paintings to the work of old masters, predicted he'd be recognised as one of the great artists of the age. Vincent read the article multiple times, unable to believe what it said. After years of rejection and indifference, someone finally understood what he was trying to do. But the praise also disturbed him. It felt undeserved, excessive. He was just painting what he saw, trying to be honest about the world. If that made him a genius, then genius was simpler than people thought. The recognition didn't change his daily routine. He still woke early, still worked for hours, still struggled with the same technical problems he'd always struggled with. Fame, if that's what this was, didn't make painting easier. It just added pressure, the expectation that every canvas would be a masterpiece. October brought another breakdown, this one lasting 2 weeks. When he recovered, he found that someone had vandalised his paintings while he was incapacitated. Paint had been smeared across canvases, brushes broken, tubes squeezed empty. Whether it was another patient or whether he'd done it himself during the episode, he couldn't say. The damage was limited but symbolic. Even here, in this supposed sanctuary, his work wasn't safe. He repainted what he could, started new canvases to replace the destroyed ones. There was no point dwelling on what had been lost. The only direction was forward. In November, he painted a portrait of the asylum's chief attendant, a man named Trabuc who'd been kind to him. The portrait shows a middle-aged man with a serious expression, wearing a dark uniform, his hands clasped in front of him. It's a respectful painting, dignified, showing genuine affection for the subject. Trabuc was one of the few people at Saint-Remy who treated Vincent like a person rather than a patient, who understood that the man who painted these extraordinary canvases was worth respecting despite his illness. Winter arrived, cold and wet. The gardens turned brown, the fields empty. Vincent painted less during these months, partly because the weather made outdoor work difficult, partly because he felt the darkness closing in. The short days depressed him. The lack of sunlight, which he needed like food, left him lethargic and hopeless. He spent hours in his room, staring at the walls, unable to summon the energy to work. But even in winter, there were moments of clarity. He painted the rain, the way it transformed the landscape into something abstract and dreamlike. He painted the stone benches in the garden, empty and wet, waiting for spring. He painted his own room, the iron bed, the simple furniture, the paintings on the walls. These interior scenes have a melancholy quality, the sense of a man waiting for something he can't quite name. In January of 1890, the critic Auvers' article appeared in a prestigious art journal, bringing Vincent's work to a much wider audience. Letters arrived at Saint-Remy from collectors interested in buying paintings, from critics wanting to write about him, from young artists asking for advice. It was overwhelming. He'd spent years invisible, and now suddenly people cared. He didn't know how to respond. Theo reported that one of Vincent's paintings had sold at an exhibition in Brussels. The Red Vineyard, a landscape showing grape pickers at work, had been purchased for 400 francs by a Belgian artist. It was the only painting Vincent sold during his lifetime, the only time anyone paid money for his work. 400 francs, not much, barely enough to cover a few months of expenses. But it was proof that his paintings had value, that someone besides Theo believed in what he was doing. February brought better weather and renewed energy. Vincent returned to the olive groves, painting them in different lights, at different times of day. The olive trees fascinated him endlessly, the way their leaves caught the sun, the complexity of their twisted forms. Each tree was different, each one a puzzle to solve, a challenge to his ability to translate three-dimensional reality into paint on a flat surface. He was also thinking about leaving Saint-Remy. A year was enough. The episodes had become less frequent, the doctors more confident in his stability. He wanted to live somewhere with more freedom, where he could work without walls and attendants, and the constant reminder that he was a patient. Theo suggested a village north of Paris called Auvers, where a doctor named Paul Gachet lived, who treated artists and was sympathetic to their peculiarities. Gachet was an amateur painter himself, understood the artistic temperament, might be able to provide supervision without confinement. It sounded promising. Vincent painted a final series of canvases at Saint-Remy, working with urgent intensity, as if trying to capture everything before he left. Almond blossoms against a blue sky, painted for Theo's newborn son. Roses in a vase, pink and white and yellow. The asylum garden one last time, the buildings and the mountains beyond. On May 16, 1890, Vincent van Gogh left Saint-Remy. He'd spent exactly 1 year there, produced nearly 150 paintings, and survived episodes that might have destroyed someone less determined. He travelled north to Paris, stayed with Theo for a few days, then continued to Auvers. He was 47 years old, exhausted, and about to enter the final chapter of his life. Auvers-sur-Oise was everything Saint-Remy was not. No walls, no attendants, no locked doors or supervised meals, or the constant awareness of being watched. It was a village 40 kilometers northwest of Paris, small enough to walk across in 20 minutes, quiet, surrounded by wheat fields and the kind of gentle rolling landscape that northern France does so well. Artists had been coming here for years, drawn by the light and the affordable rooms and the fact that Paris was close enough to matter, but far enough away to ignore. Vincent arrived on May 20th, 1890. He found lodging at an inn run by the Ravu family, a modest establishment on the main square. His room was tiny, barely large enough for a bed and a chair, tucked under the eaves on the 3rd floor. The walls sloped with the roof. There was one small window that looked out over the village roofs and the church steeple beyond. It cost 3 francs and 50 centimes a day, meals included. He could afford it. The next morning he went to meet Dr. Paul Gachet, the physician Theo had recommended. Gachet lived in a large house on the edge of the village, surrounded by a garden that was more chaos than design, plants growing wherever they pleased. He was 58 years old, eccentric in the way doctors who treat artists often are, interested in art and literature and radical politics. He collected paintings, etched his own prints, and had been friends with several of the impressionists. He understood that creativity and mental instability sometimes came as a package. Vincent liked him immediately. Gachet didn't treat him like a patient to be managed or a problem to be solved. He treated him like an artist, someone whose work mattered, whose struggles were part of the process. They talked about painting, about colour theory, about the difficulty of capturing certain effects. Gachet showed Vincent his collection, canvases by Pissarro and Cézanne and Guillaume. Vincent felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Recognition. Not pity, not concern, just a simple acknowledgement that what he was doing had value. He started painting immediately. The church at Auvers, a massive structure that dominated the village, its Gothic architecture, dark against a deep blue sky. The painting has an unsettled quality. The building seems to pulse slightly, as if the stone itself is alive. The path in the foreground splits, leading the eye in 2 directions at once. It's beautiful and disturbing in equal measure. He painted the thatched cottages that line the village streets, their roofs golden in the afternoon sun, gardens bursting with flowers. He painted portraits of local people, a young girl in a field, a peasant woman against a background of wheat. The work poured out of him, sometimes 2 or 3 canvases in a single day. He was racing against something, though he couldn't have said what. The wheat fields around Auvers became his obsession. They stretched in every direction, vast and open, changing colour with the light and the season. In late May they were still green, but by June they would turn gold, ready for harvest. Vincent set up his easel in the middle of these fields, working in the open air, the sun beating down, the wind moving through the stalks. He painted horizontal canvases, trying to capture the sheer expanse of it, the way the wheat seemed to go on forever. Dr. Gachet invited Vincent to dinner regularly. They ate in the garden, surrounded by flowers and vegetables, and Gachet's 2 teenage children, Paul and Marguerite. Vincent painted Marguerite at the piano, painted the doctor himself, sitting at a table with a foxglove plant in front of him, his chin resting on his hand, his expression melancholy. The portrait captures something essential about Gachet, his sadness, his sympathy, his understanding that life contains more pain than most people acknowledge. But Vincent's mental state was fragile. The episodes hadn't stopped, they'd just become less predictable. He would be fine for days, working productively, eating meals with the Ravu family, sleeping reasonably well. Then something would shift. The anxiety would return, the sense that the world was too much, too bright, too loud, too impossible to navigate. He would retreat to his room, lie on the bed, stare at the sloping ceiling, and try to ride it out. Theo visited in early June, bringing his wife Jo and their baby son, also named Vincent. They spent the day together, walking through the village, visiting Dr. Gachet, looking at the paintings Vincent had completed in his first weeks at Auvers. It should have been joyful. It was, mostly. But there was an undercurrent of worry. Theo looked exhausted. He'd been having problems at work, conflicts with his employers at Goupil, about the direction of the gallery, about which artist to support. Money was tight. He had a family to support now, responsibilities that weighed on him constantly. Vincent understood what this meant. For 10 years, Theo had been sending him money every month, supporting his work, believing in him when no one else did. But that couldn't continue forever. Theo had his own life, his own obligations. Vincent was a burden, had always been a burden, would always be a burden. The thought was unbearable. After Theo left, Vincent threw himself back into work with even more intensity. He painted the wheat fields under storm clouds, the sky dark and threatening, the wheat bending in the wind. He painted crows rising from the fields, black shapes against the turbulent sky, the path through the wheat leading nowhere in particular. These paintings have a desperate quality, as if he's trying to capture something he knows is slipping away. In early July, Vincent travelled to Paris to visit Theo. The visit did not go well. Theo's apartment was cramped and noisy. The baby crying, Joe stressed. Theo himself barely holding things together. They argued about money, about the future, about whether Vincent should continue painting or find some other way to support himself. It was a terrible conversation, the kind where nothing gets resolved and everything gets worse. Vincent returned to Auvers shaken. He painted the town hall on July 14th, Bastille Day, with flags hanging from the windows, trying to capture something celebratory, but the painting feels forced, as if he's going through motions he no longer believes in. He wrote to Theo, trying to apologise for the argument, trying to explain that he understood the burden he represented, that he was grateful beyond words for everything Theo had done. The letter is heartbreaking, full of love and guilt and the terrible awareness that love sometimes isn't enough. The wheat was ready for harvest now, the fields golden, workers moving through the stalks with scythes. Vincent painted them obsessively. These vast horizontal landscapes where earth and sky meet in a line so distant it might be the edge of the world. The colours are intense, yellows and blues and greens that vibrate against each other, creating a sense of movement, even in stillness. On July 27, 1890, Vincent van Gogh walked into the wheat fields, behind the chateau at Auvers, carrying a revolver. What happened next has been debated by historians and biographers for over a century. The accepted version is that he shot himself in the chest, the bullet lodging near his heart, but not killing him immediately. He stumbled back to the Ravoux Inn, climbed the stairs to his room, and collapsed on the bed. The Ravoux family found him there, bleeding, barely conscious. They sent for Dr. Gachet, who came immediately but could do little. The bullet was too deep to remove safely, the damage too severe. Theo was telegraphed in Paris and arrived the next morning, sitting by Vincent's bedside, holding his hand. They talked quietly, or Theo talked, while Vincent drifted in and out of consciousness. What they said to each other, we don't know. Those words belong to them alone. Vincent van Gogh died at 1:30 in the morning on July 29th, 1890. He was 37 years old. His last words, according to Theo, were, "The sadness will last forever." Whether he actually said this or whether it's something Theo remembered or invented later, we can't know. But it captures something true about Vincent's life, the weight he carried, the pain that never quite left him. The funeral was held the next day in Auvers. Dr. Gachet organised it, covering the walls of the room where Vincent's body lay with his paintings, transforming the space into a kind of gallery. The coffin was simple, covered with flowers, surrounded by the canvases he'd painted in his final weeks: sunflowers, wheat fields, the church at Auvers. A small group attended, Theo broken and weeping, Dr. Gachet and his children. A few local artists who'd known Vincent slightly, Père Tanguy, the paint seller from Paris who'd always believed in him. They walked behind the coffin to the cemetery, on the hill above the village, Theo barely able to stand, supported by friends. Vincent was buried in a simple grave, no elaborate headstone, just a marker with his name and dates. Theo tried to continue. He returned to Paris, went back to work, attempted to resume his life, but something had broken in him. He'd spent 10 years holding Vincent up, believing in him, fighting for him, and now Vincent was gone, and all that effort felt meaningless. He began having health problems, mental and physical, deteriorating rapidly. By autumn, he was unable to work. By winter, he was in a hospital in Utrecht, his mind collapsing under the weight of grief and stress and something that might have been hereditary, the same instability that had plagued Vincent. Theo van Gogh died on January 25th, 1891, 6 months after his brother. He was 33 years old. Jo, his widow, was left alone with their infant son and hundreds of Vincent's paintings that no one wanted to buy. She could have sold them for whatever she could get, could have let them scatter into obscurity. Instead, she became Vincent's champion, organising exhibitions, lending paintings to museums, preserving his letters, building the reputation that Vincent never lived to see. The recognition came slowly at first, then faster. By the turn of the century, Vincent van Gogh was being discussed in serious art journals. By 1910, major museums were acquiring his work. By 1920, he was considered one of the most important artists of the 19th century. Today, his paintings sell for hundreds of millions of dollars. His face is recognizable worldwide. The Starry Night, the Sunflowers, the self-portraits have been reproduced so many times they've become almost cliché, familiar to people who've never set foot in a museum. But fame was never the point. Vincent didn't paint to be famous. He painted because he couldn't not paint, because it was the only way he knew to make sense of a world that never quite made sense to him. He painted wheat fields and stars and sunflowers because they moved him, because they contained some truth he needed to express, because the act of putting paint on canvas was the only thing that felt real. The tragedy isn't that he died young or that he never knew success. The tragedy is that he spent his entire life feeling like a failure, convinced that his work was worthless, that he was a burden to everyone around him, that he would be forgotten as soon as he was gone. He never knew that millions of people would stand in front of his paintings and weep. He never knew that his letters would be published and read and studied. He never knew that the wheat fields he painted in those final desperate weeks would be seen as masterpieces, that the sadness and beauty he captured would speak to people across centuries and continents and cultures. Vincent never knew that his final painting, The Wheat Field with Crows, would become one of the most analysed images in art history, studied for what it might reveal about his state of mind in those last days. What would he have thought if he could have seen the future? If he could have known that a century later, people would line up for hours just to spend a few minutes in front of his paintings, that his bedroom in Arles would be recreated in museums, that his letters to Theo would be published and translated into dozens of languages. Would it have changed anything? Would it have given him a reason to stay? We'll never know. All we have are the paintings themselves, the letters, the testimony of people who knew him. And what emerges from those fragments is a portrait of someone who experienced the world with an intensity that was almost unbearable, who felt too much, saw too much, cared too much. There's a letter Vincent wrote to Theo in 1882, early in his career, when he was still struggling to learn his craft. He said, "I am always doing what I cannot do yet in order to learn how to do it." That sentence captures something essential about Vincent van Gogh. He was always reaching beyond his grasp, always attempting something just beyond his ability, always failing and trying again. The paintings we now consider masterpieces were, to Vincent, evidence of his inadequacy. He could see what he wanted to achieve, but never quite believed he'd achieved it. The gap between vision and execution tormented him. Every painting was a failure, just a slightly less terrible failure than the one before. This is the cruel irony of artistic genius. The very sensitivity that allows someone to create profound work also makes them acutely aware of the distance between what they've created and what they imagined. Vincent could paint a wheat field that would move people to tears a century later, but all he could see were the ways it fell short of what he'd wanted to capture. His contemporaries didn't help. Most of the artists he admired, the ones whose work he studied and tried to learn from, either ignored him or dismissed him. Gauguin, who spent 2 months working alongside Vincent in Arles, later described him as a madman whose art was interesting but limited. The critics who bothered to mention him at all usually did so to mock his crude technique, his violent colours, his lack of refinement. Only a handful of people recognised what Vincent was doing. Theo, always, a few fellow artists who understood that Vincent was attempting something new, even if they couldn't quite articulate what it was. And toward the end, a small group of younger painters who saw in Vincent's work a way forward, a break from the academic tradition that had dominated European art for centuries. But recognition from a few sympathetic observers wasn't enough to sustain Vincent. He needed to believe in himself, and that belief kept slipping away. Every rejection, every criticism, every painting that didn't sell reinforced his conviction that he was deluding himself, that his work was worthless, that he should give up. He kept painting anyway. That's the remarkable thing. Even in his darkest moments, even when he was convinced he had no talent, even when the asylum doctors were telling him he should abandon art for his health, he kept painting. It was compulsion as much as choice. The need to create was stronger than his despair. Look at what he produced in the last 2 years of his life. The starry night, the irises, the olive trees, the self-portrait with bandaged ear, the bedroom in Arles, the portraits of Dr. Gachet and his daughter, the wheat fields, painting after painting after painting, each one a desperate attempt to capture something he couldn't quite express in words. The colours got brighter, more intense, the brushwork got more expressive, more violent, the compositions got stranger, more dreamlike. Vincent was moving further from naturalism, further from what a photograph could capture, towards something more emotional, more psychological. He was painting not what he saw, but what he felt, and what he felt was overwhelming. Art historians debate whether Vincent's mental illness enhanced his work or damaged it, whether the paintings from his final years are great because of his suffering or in spite of it. It's the wrong question. Vincent's art and his anguish were inseparable. You can't extract the pain from the paintings any more than you can extract the colour. They're part of the same thing. What's clear is that Vincent understood something about human emotion that most people never grasp. He could take a simple subject, a chair or a pair of shoes or a vase of sunflowers, and make it express loneliness or hope or despair. He could paint a wheat field and make you feel the weight of existence, the beauty and terror of being alive. This is why his work endures. Not because of the technical skill, though his technique became formidable, not because of the bold colours, though they're striking. His work endures because it's honest in a way that most art isn't. Vincent never learned to hide his feelings, never developed the protective shell that most adults acquire. His emotional life remained raw and exposed, and he put that rawness into his paintings. When you stand in front of a Van Gogh, you're not looking at a representation of reality. You're looking at reality filtered through Vincent's particular way of experiencing the world. You're seeing what it felt like to be him, to see the way he saw, to feel the intensity he felt. It's an intimate act, almost uncomfortable. No wonder his contemporaries found it disturbing. The question that haunts anyone who studies Vincent's life is whether there was an alternative path. Could he have been helped? Could modern psychiatry have given him tools to manage his condition? Could a different environment, more support, less pressure, have allowed him to create it without destroying himself? Maybe, but we're asking the wrong question again. Vincent made choices. He chose to pursue art knowing it might break him. He chose to paint even when it exhausted him. He chose to keep going when every rational calculation said he should stop. Those choices were his, and they resulted in work that changed how we think about art about emotion, about what painting can do. The price was terrible, but Vincent paid it willingly, or at least knowingly. He understood the cost and decided it was worth it, or at least necessary. The tragedy isn't that he suffered. The tragedy is that he suffered alone, convinced his suffering was meaningless, unaware that it would eventually illuminate something for millions of people who would never meet him. After Vincent died, after Theo died, after Joe had spent years building Vincent's reputation, a strange thing happened. Vincent became a cultural phenomenon, not just an artist but a symbol. He became the archetype of the tortured genius, the misunderstood artist, the person who sacrifices everything for their vision. This romanticization of Vincent's suffering is dangerous. It suggests that great art requires great pain, that creativity and mental illness are somehow linked, that we should celebrate the suffering of artists rather than trying to prevent it. Vincent's story has been used to justify neglecting artists, to excuse not supporting them, to argue that struggle is good for art. This is exactly wrong. Vincent didn't create great art because he was mentally ill. He created great art despite being mentally ill, fighting against his condition every day, trying desperately to maintain enough stability to keep working. His illness didn't enhance his vision, it threatened to destroy it, and only his extraordinary determination allowed him to keep painting through the episodes, through the hospitalizations, through the despair. If Vincent had received proper treatment, if he'd had access to modern medications, if he'd lived in a society that understood mental illness as a medical condition rather than a moral failing, he might have lived longer, he might have created more, he might have experienced some happiness, and his work would have been just as profound, just as moving, just as important. The suffering wasn't necessary, the dedication was. Vincent's achievement wasn't surviving long enough to create despite his pain. His achievement was having the courage to keep trying when everything told him to give up, the discipline to work even when the work brought him no reward, the integrity to paint what he felt rather than what would sell. Those qualities, dedication, courage, integrity, those are what made Vincent van Gogh a great artist. The mental illness was just something he had to overcome, or try to overcome, or live with when he couldn't overcome it. Today, when people think about Vincent van Gogh, they often think about the dramatic moments, the ear, the asylum, the suicide. But the real story is quieter and more persistent. It's about showing up day after day to paint when no one cared, when nothing sold, when every indication suggested you were wasting your time. It's about believing in something you're doing, even when you don't quite believe in yourself. It's about continuing when continuation seems pointless. That's the legacy that matters. Not the mythology of the mad genius, but the example of someone who kept working when work seemed futile, who kept creating when creation brought him no joy, who kept going when going seemed impossible. Vincent van Gogh painted because he had to, because it was the only thing that made sense in a world that rarely made sense, because the act of transforming what he saw and felt into colour and form was the only way he knew to connect with other people, even though he never got to see that connection happen. He painted wheat fields in the blazing sun. He painted stars swirling in the night sky. He painted his own face over and over, trying to understand who he was. He painted sunflowers because they moved him, because their brief moment of glory before they withered felt like his own life compressed into metaphor. And now, more than a century later, those paintings hang in museums on every continent. People who speak languages Vincent never heard, who live in countries he never visited, stand in front of his work and feel something. Recognition, maybe. Connection. The sense that someone, somewhere, once felt what they feel now. That they're not alone in their struggle to make sense of existence. That's what Vincent gave us. Not answers, but company. Not solutions, but understanding. Not perfection, but honesty about imperfection. His paintings don't make the world make sense. They acknowledge that the world doesn't make sense and find beauty in that chaos anyway. The wheat field where Vincent shot himself still exists. It's been developed around, but you can still walk through it, still see the landscape he painted in those final weeks. People visit it, pilgrims seeking some connection to the artist whose work touched them. They stand where he stood, look at what he looked at, try to imagine what he felt. But the field doesn't explain Vincent. The paintings don't explain Vincent. Even his letters, hundreds of them, intimate and revealing, don't fully explain him. Because at the centre of every great artist is a mystery that can't be solved. Why this person? Why this work? Why does one person's vision endure while millions of others fade? We can analyse technique, we can trace influences, we can document struggles and triumphs, but we can't quite reach the core of what made Vincent see the world the way he did. What made him need to paint it with such urgency? What made his particular combination of skill and feeling and perception produce these specific works that continue to move us? Vincent himself seemed aware of this mystery. In his letters to Theo, he often wrote about not understanding himself, about feeling driven by forces he couldn't name, about painting things without knowing why they mattered so much. He was conscious of his own consciousness in a way that made him both more self-aware and more confused. The mythology around Vincent, the tortured genius narrative, tries to solve this mystery by making the suffering the explanation, as if mental illness was the source of the vision, as if pain was what enabled him to see differently. But this gets it backwards. Vincent saw the way he saw because of who he was fundamentally. The mental illness interfered with that vision, made it harder to realise, made the process more painful. It didn't create the gift, it complicated it. Think about what Vincent actually painted. Fields under rain, trees in bloom, working people doing everyday tasks. His own room, spare and simple, a chair, a pair of worn boots, flowers in a vase. These aren't the subjects of madness. They're the subjects of someone paying attention to life with unusual intensity. Someone who looked at ordinary things and saw them as extraordinary. Someone who understood that a pair of old shoes could contain an entire life story, that a chair could be a portrait, that the way light falls on a wheat field at a particular moment is worth preserving forever. This is what made Vincent an artist. Not his breakdowns, not his hospitalizations, not his inability to function in conventional society, his ability to see, his compulsion to capture what he saw, his willingness to work obsessively to develop the skills that would let him express his vision. The ear incident, for all its notoriety, tells us almost nothing about Vincent's art. It tells us he was in crisis. It tells us his mental state was deteriorating. It tells us he was capable of self-harm. But it doesn't explain why his paintings of orchards in bloom are so luminous, why his portraits capture something essential about their subjects, why his landscapes feel alive in ways that most landscapes don't. We focus on the dramatic because drama is easy to remember, easy to retell, easy to package into a story that feels complete. Artist suffers, artist creates. Suffering and creation are connected, simple, satisfying, wrong. Vincent's suffering and his creation were separate streams that ran parallel through his life. Sometimes they intersected. The asylum paintings have a particular quality, an intensity that might have been shaped by his circumstances. But the genius was there before the asylum and would have continued after if he'd lived. The paintings he made during stable periods, when he was relatively healthy and productive, are just as powerful as the ones made during crisis. What Vincent needed wasn't more suffering. It was more support, more stability, more time, more encouragement, more sales so he didn't have to rely entirely on Theo, more recognition so he could believe his work mattered, more medical care that might have helped him manage his condition, more of the things that would have let him keep working without the constant weight of failure and rejection. The tragedy isn't that Vincent was mentally ill. Mental illness happens. It's not romantic or meaningful or purposeful. It just is. The tragedy is that Vincent lived in a time and place where mental illness was poorly understood, where treatment was limited and often harmful, where someone in his condition had few options and little hope of improvement. The tragedy is that he died believing he was a burden, believing his work was worthless, believing he had failed at everything he tried. That's what we should be angry about when we think about Vincent's story. Not that he suffered, but that his suffering was preventable, or at least manageable, with better support. Not that he was different, but that difference was met with rejection and incomprehension. Not that he struggled, but that he struggled alone. His relationship with Theo stands out precisely because it was so unusual. Most people in Vincent's position didn't have someone who believed in them unconditionally, who supported them financially and emotionally year after year, who preserved their work and tried to promote it even when it seemed hopeless. Theo was extraordinary. The fact that Vincent needed someone extraordinary just to survive tells us how inadequate the normal support systems were. After Vincent died, Theo tried to fulfill his brother's dream of recognition. He organised exhibitions, contacted critics, showed the work to anyone who might appreciate it. But Theo was already ill himself, worn down by years of stress and his own health problems. 6 months after Vincent's death, Theo died too. He was 33 years old. The brothers are buried side by side in Auvers, their graves marked by matching headstones, together in death as they were in life. Jo, Theo's widow, inherited hundreds of paintings and drawings, boxes of letters, the complete artistic output of a man the world had ignored. She could have sold them for whatever small amounts they might bring, cleared out the storage space, moved on with her life. Instead, she became the guardian of Vincent's legacy. She organised the works, she transcribed the letters, she lent paintings to exhibitions. She worked for decades to build the reputation that had eluded Vincent in life. Without Jo, we might not have Vincent van Gogh as we know him. The paintings would have scattered, many lost or destroyed. The letters would have disappeared. The story would be incomplete. She understood what Theo had understood, that Vincent's work mattered, that it deserved to be seen, that someday people would recognise its value. She was right. By the early 20th century, Vincent's reputation was growing. Exhibitions in Paris, Amsterdam, Berlin attracted attention. Critics began writing seriously about his work. Other artists cited him as an influence. The paintings that hadn't sold for 50 francs were now worth thousands. Museums competed to acquire them. Collectors who had dismissed him during his lifetime now claimed to have always recognised his genius. This posthumous fame is often presented as validation, as if Vincent's suffering was redeemed by later success. But Vincent wasn't there to see it. The recognition he desperately wanted, that might have given him reason to keep living, came too late. He died thinking he was a failure. The fact that he wasn't doesn't change what he felt, and the fame itself became complicated. As Vincent's work became more valuable, his story became more mythologized. The struggling artist became the mad genius. The complex, difficult, often frustrating person became a symbol. The paintings became commodities, investments, status symbols. The intimate relationship Vincent wanted with viewers, the connection through shared feeling, became mediated by markets and museums and the overwhelming machinery of art world celebrity. Today, Vincent van Gogh is one of the most famous artists who ever lived. His paintings sell for tens of millions of dollars. His face is recognizable worldwide. His story has been told in dozens of books and films. Millions of people visit museums specifically to see his work. He's achieved a level of fame that would have been unimaginable to him, that he specifically didn't want because he feared fame would corrupt the purity of the work. The irony is profound. The man who wanted to be understood became misunderstood on a massive scale. His paintings, which he created as attempts at communication, became so famous that it's almost impossible to see them freshly, to look at them without the weight of cultural significance obscuring the actual image. The person who valued authenticity above everything became the subject of endless romanticization and distortion. But here's what persists despite all that. Put someone who knows nothing about Vincent van Gogh in front of one of his paintings. Don't tell them who painted it, when, under what circumstances. Just let them look. Many of them will feel something. The colour will reach them. The brushwork will communicate energy, feeling, life. The painting will work on them the way Vincent hoped it would. Directly, emotionally, honestly. That's what survives the mythology. The actual work. The thing Vincent made with his hands, with his particular way of seeing, with his urgent need to express what he felt. The paintings don't require you to know about the ear or the asylum or the suicide. They don't need the tragic backstory to function. They work because Vincent learned to paint, because he developed a visual language that could convey feeling, because he looked at the world with uncommon intensity and found ways to share what he saw. This is what we should take from Vincent's life. Not the suffering, which tells us nothing useful. Not the rejection, which tells us only that his contemporaries made a mistake. Not the dramatic incidents, which are memorable but peripheral. What we should take is the example of dedication, of continuing to work when work brings no reward, of developing your abilities even when no one values them, of staying true to your vision even when that vision isolates you. Vincent painted for 10 years. In those 10 years, he created approximately 2,000 works. That's one every couple of days on average, though the actual pattern was periods of intense productivity followed by periods when he couldn't work at all. 2,000 attempts to capture what he saw and felt. 2,000 efforts to communicate across the gap between one person's inner experience and another's. 2,000 small acts of faith that this mattered, that someone someday would understand. Most of those paintings are now in museums or private collections, preserved and protected, studied and admired. But they started as just paint on canvas, created by a man who wasn't sure anyone would ever care, who kept painting anyway because painting was what he did, because the alternative was giving up entirely, because between bouts of illness and despair, there were moments when the work felt possible and even meaningful. That's the real legacy. Not genius, which is just a word we use for things we can't quite explain. Not madness, which is just a condition some people have. But persistence, the decision to keep going, the choice to make one more painting, then another, building up a body of work piece by piece, day by day, without knowing if any of it would matter to anyone but yourself. Vincent died thinking he had failed. By conventional measures, he had. He hadn't supported himself with his art. He hadn't achieved recognition. He hadn't built a career or a reputation. He had produced hundreds of paintings that almost no one wanted. But he had also done the work. He had painted what he saw, felt what he felt, tried to express the inexpressible. He had been honest in a way that few people managed to be. He had created something that would outlast him by centuries. We can't know what Vincent would think of his current fame. Maybe he would be satisfied that his work finally found its audience. Maybe he would be horrified by the commercialization and mythology. Maybe he would just be relieved that Theo's faith was vindicated, that the years of support weren't wasted, that someone did understand after all. What we can know is this: the paintings exist. They continue to move people, to communicate across time and culture and language. They prove that one person's vision, honestly expressed, can resonate with millions of others. They demonstrate that the struggle to create meaning in a chaotic world is not futile, even when it feels that way, even when recognition never comes, even when the creator doesn't live to see the impact of their work. Vincent van Gogh was not a saint or a martyr or a symbol. He was a person who tried to do something difficult, who failed by most measures, who kept trying anyway, and whose trying mattered more than he could have imagined. The truth is simpler and harder than the myths suggest. Vincent van Gogh was not driven by divine madness or touched by supernatural vision. He was a human being trying to make sense of what he saw and felt, using the only tools available to him: paint and canvas, colour and form, the attempt to capture something that moved him and share it with others. That's all art ever is. One person saying, "I saw this, I felt this, did you?" and hoping for an answer. Vincent rarely got the answer he hoped for during his lifetime. But the question remains in every painting he left behind. The swirling stars over a sleeping village, the twisted olive trees under a burning sky, the crows rising from a wheat field. Each one asks, "Do you see what I see? Do you feel what I feel?" And millions of people, more than a century later, answer yes. This isn't because Vincent was special in some mystical sense. It's because he was honest in a way that transcends the specific circumstances of his life. The loneliness he painted is the loneliness many people feel. The beauty he saw in ordinary things is a beauty that exists for anyone willing to look. The struggle to find meaning and connection in a world that often seems indifferent is a struggle that hasn't ended just because he died in 1890. The paintings work because they're true, not factually accurate. Vincent wasn't trying to reproduce what a camera would see, but emotionally honest. He painted what things felt like to him, and it turns out that those feelings are recognizable to others. The cypress trees really do seem to reach toward the sky with a kind of desperate urgency. The night sky really does seem to swirl with hidden energy. The simple room in Arles really does feel both comforting and slightly sad. Vincent gave us a way to see these things. Not the only way, but a valid one. A way that makes visible something that was always there, but might have gone unnoticed without his intervention. That's what survives. Not the tragic biography or the dramatic stories or the record prices at auction. The actual paintings. The specific application of specific colours to specific canvases. The physical objects that Vincent made with his hands, working hour after hour, year after year, trying to get it right. And here's what makes the story both hopeful and heartbreaking. Vincent did get it right. He achieved what he set out to achieve. He created work that communicated his vision to others. He made paintings that would move and inspire people for generations. He succeeded, but he died without knowing it. He died thinking he had failed. He died believing that his work would be forgotten, that the years of effort had been wasted, that he had asked his brother to sacrifice for nothing. The success came too late for him to experience it. The vindication arrived after he could no longer benefit from it. The understanding he craved was offered by people who would never have a chance to tell him they understood. This is the actual tragedy. Not that Vincent was troubled or poor or unappreciated. Those things happen to many people and continue to happen. The tragedy is the timing, that he was so close to creating something that would matter to millions and never got to know he'd done it. What do we do with this? What lesson do we take from a story about someone who succeeded only after they stopped existing to appreciate the success? Perhaps this: the work matters more than the recognition. The doing matters more than the reward. Vincent painted because painting was what he needed to do, not because it brought him fame or money or even peace. He painted because the alternative was not painting, and that was worse. There's something in that approach that applies beyond art. The things worth doing are often worth doing even if no one notices, even if no one cares, even if you never see the results. You do them because they align with what you believe matters. You do them because the doing itself has meaning, separate from any external validation. Vincent painted sunflowers because sunflowers moved him. He painted the postman because the postman was his friend. He painted the night sky because looking at it made him feel something he wanted to capture. The paintings weren't means to an end. They were the end. The act of making them was the point. The fame that came later doesn't change that. It doesn't retroactively make the work worthwhile. The work was already worthwhile. The fame just made it visible to people who might otherwise have never known it existed. And maybe that's the real story. Not about genius or madness or tragedy, about someone who did work that mattered to them, that expressed something true about their experience, and who kept doing it even when every external indicator suggested they should stop. Someone who bet everything on the value of that work and lost the bet in every practical sense, but turned out to be right in the end. The paintings hang in museums now. The Starry Night, the Sunflowers, the bedroom in Arles, the potato eaters, the self-portraits, cafe terrace at night, wheat field with crows. They're protected behind glass, lit carefully, viewed by millions. They've become icons reproduced on everything from coffee mugs to shower curtains. Their images so familiar that it's easy to forget they're actual objects. Made by actual hands, created in specific moments by a specific person. But they are those things. Each one represents hours of work, decisions about colour and composition, struggles with technique, moments of satisfaction when something worked, moments of frustration when it didn't, all the mundane reality of making things. Vincent wasn't painting masterpieces, he was painting paintings. Some turned out better than others. Some captured what he wanted to capture, some didn't. He kept going because that's what painters do. They paint. They try to make the next one better than the last one. They work through problems and learn from mistakes and occasionally surprise themselves with what appears on the canvas. The mythology surrounding Vincent threatens to obscure this reality. When we talk about tortured genius and divine inspiration, we make what he did seem impossible for ordinary people. We create a category called artist that's separate from normal human experience. We suggest that you either have the gift or you don't. And if you don't, there's no point trying. But Vincent didn't have a gift that descended from heaven. He developed skills through practice. He learned techniques through study and experimentation. He made hundreds of terrible paintings before he made any good ones. He copied other artists' work to understand how they achieved certain effects. He read books about colour theory. He sought advice from other painters. He worked. The intensity with which he worked, the single-minded focus he brought to it, the willingness to sacrifice everything else, those things were unusual. Most people can't or won't do that. But the process itself wasn't magical. It was the same process anyone follows when learning anything. Try, fail, learn, try again, improve incrementally, keep going. What made Vincent's work distinctive wasn't that he was touched by genius, it was that he paid attention to what he actually saw and felt, rather than what he was supposed to see and feel. He didn't paint what art critics said was important. He didn't follow the conventions of academic painting. He looked at the world around him and tried to capture it honestly, in a way that reflected his actual experience. That's harder than it sounds. Most of us see what we expect to see. We look at a tree and our brain supplies the concept tree without really registering the specific tree in front of us. We move through the world on autopilot, guided by assumptions and categories rather than direct observation. Vincent looked at the actual tree. He noticed how the light hit it, how the branches twisted, how it related to the sky and ground around it. He saw it fresh each time, as if he'd never seen a tree before. And then he tried to paint what he saw, not what he knew a tree was supposed to look like. This approach made his work strange to contemporaries. Trees don't look like that. The sky doesn't swirl. Colours don't vibrate with that intensity. But Vincent wasn't painting objectively accurate representations. He was painting subjective truth, what it felt like to look at those things. And it turns out that subjective truth, honestly rendered, can be more powerful than objective accuracy. The paintings feel alive because Vincent was fully alive when he made them. Present, attentive, engaged with what he was doing, not thinking about fame or money or posterity, just trying to get the yellow of the sunflowers right, trying to capture the energy he felt when looking at the night sky, trying to make the canvas reflect what was happening inside him when he looked at the world. That immediacy, that presence, that honesty, it comes through. You can feel it when you stand in front of the actual paintings. Not the reproductions, which flatten and diminish them, but the real objects, with their thick impasto and visible brushstrokes and unexpected colour choices. You can sense the person who made them, the decisions and impulses and corrections. The human being who stood where you're standing and applied paint to canvas and hoped it would communicate something. And it does communicate, across more than a century, across differences in culture and language and experience. The paintings still work, they still move people, they still offer a way of seeing that feels fresh and true. Vincent van Gogh created something that outlasted him, not because he was trying to create something timeless, not because he had some grand vision of his legacy, but because he paid attention, because he was honest, because he did the work without knowing if it would matter to anyone but himself. The work mattered. It matters still. Not because of the mythology or the market value or the fame, because the paintings themselves are good. They show us something worth seeing. They expand our sense of what's possible. They prove that one person's vision, honestly expressed, can resonate with millions of others. That's the real story. Not about madness or tragedy or misunderstood genius. About someone who did work that mattered, who expressed something true about their experience of being alive, and who kept going even when everything suggested they should stop. Someone who didn't get to see the impact of their work, but who did the work anyway. The paintings remain. They'll remain long after everyone currently alive is gone. They'll continue to move and inspire people who haven't been born yet. They'll keep asking their quiet question. Do you see what I see? Do you feel what I feel? And people will keep answering yes. Vincent van Gogh died in 1890, believing he had failed. He was wrong. The work succeeded. It succeeded so completely that it's hard to imagine a world without it. The Starry Night is as much a part of our visual culture as anything created in the last 2 centuries. Those swirling stars, that glowing moon, that quiet village beneath the turbulent sky, they've become part of how we see the world. Vincent gave us that, not through genius or madness or divine inspiration, through work, through attention, through honesty, through the decision to keep painting even when no one wanted the paintings, through the faith that doing the work mattered, regardless of whether anyone recognized its value. That faith was justified. The work did matter. It matters still. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the fact that something good was created, that something true was expressed, that someone's vision found its audience eventually. Perhaps that's what we remember. Not the suffering, which was real but not unique. Not the poverty, which was circumstantial. Not even the suicide, which was tragic but comprehensible. The paintings. The actual physical paintings. The things Vincent made. The legacy that speaks for itself, requiring no mythology or explanation, just colour and form and the human impulse to share what we see and feel with others who might understand. The wheat still grows in Auvers, not the same stalks Vincent painted. Those were harvested and consumed a century ago, but wheat nonetheless. The field looks different now, surrounded by houses that didn't exist when he walked through it with his easel, but the light is probably similar. The way the sun hits the grain in late afternoon, the shadows that move across the ground as clouds pass overhead. Those things haven't changed. People visit that field. They stand where Vincent stood and try to feel what he felt. They take photographs. They imagine the man who was there in July 1890, who looked at this ordinary landscape and saw something worth capturing, who believed, despite everything, that making one more painting mattered. What were they looking for, those visitors? Connection to genius? Evidence of madness? Some explanation for how someone could create such powerful work and remain so thoroughly miserable? The field doesn't provide answers. It's just a field. The meaning we bring to it, the significance we assign, that's all ours. Vincent would have understood this. He spent his life trying to paint things as they actually were, stripped of the meanings other people had imposed on them. A chair was just a chair until he painted it. Then it became something else, something that carried weight and feeling in the presence of absence. His brother is buried next to him in the cemetery on the hill. Theo, who believed when no one else did, who sent money every month for a decade, who preserved the paintings and the letters and the memory. They're side by side now. Their graves marked by identical stones, covered in ivy. People leave sunflowers there sometimes. Vincent and Theo would probably find that strange. They were never sentimental about such things, but the gesture makes sense to those who leave them. Some way of acknowledging what was given, what was created, what endures. The letters between the brothers fill volumes now. They've been published and translated and studied. Scholars analyse them for insights into Vincent's working methods, his influences, his state of mind, dates. Students read them to understand the creative process, but they were never meant for us. They were private conversations between two people who loved each other, trying to stay connected across distance and difficulty. The fact that we read them now feels like eavesdropping, but maybe that's appropriate. Vincent wanted to communicate. The letters, like the paintings, were attempts to bridge the gap between one consciousness and another. He succeeded more completely than he knew. Jo van Gogh Bonger deserves more credit than she usually receives. Without her, there might be no Vincent van Gogh as we know him. She inherited hundreds of paintings that the world had rejected, that took up space and cost money to store. She could have cut her losses. Instead, she spent decades building the reputation her husband and brother-in-law never lived to see. She organised exhibitions. She published the letters. She lent paintings to museums. She refused to let the work disappear. This wasn't obligation, it was choice. She believed the paintings mattered, and she made other people believe it too. The money Vincent's work generates now would have seemed impossible to him. Sunflowers sold for nearly $40 million in 1987. Portrait of Dr. Gachet went for over $80 million in 1990. The numbers are obscene, disconnected from any reality Vincent would recognise. He sold one painting for 400 francs in his lifetime. The disparity between that and the current market value of his work tells us something about how we value art, or perhaps how we value money. Vincent would have found the whole thing grotesque. He wanted his paintings to be seen, not locked away in bank vaults as investments. But maybe there's something fitting about it too. The rejection was so complete during his lifetime that the posthumous acceptance had to be equally extreme to balance it out. The world that ignored him for 37 years has spent the last century making up for it. Not that Vincent cares, he's beyond caring. The compensation comes too late to matter to the person who earned it. What remains after everything else falls away? Not the mythology, which changes with each generation's needs. Not the market value, which rises and falls with economic cycles. Not even the biography, which gets reinterpreted and revised as new information emerges. The paintings remain. Physical objects made of canvas and oil paint, created by a specific person in specific moments. They exist independent of what we think about them, what we say about them, how much we pay for them. You can stand in front of one and ignore everything you know about Vincent van Gogh. Forget the ear, the asylum, the suicide. Forget the poverty and rejection. Forget the posthumous fame. Just look at the painting, the way colour is applied, the energy of the brushwork, the choices made about composition and form. The thing itself separate from the story. Does it still work? For many people, yes. The paintings communicate something even when stripped of context. Not to everyone, art doesn't work that way, but to enough people that the work justifies itself. Vincent succeeded in his actual goal, which was never fame or fortune, but simply to make paintings that expressed his vision of the world. Whether anyone recognized that success during his lifetime turned out to be irrelevant to the success itself. The lesson isn't about suffering producing art. Vincent's mental illness didn't enhance his work. It complicated it. The lesson isn't about posthumous vindication either. Recognition that comes after death benefits only those who remain. The lesson is simpler and harder. Do the work, not because it will make you famous or wealthy or even happy. Do it because it's the work you need to do, because it expresses something true about your experience. Because the alternative is not doing it, and that's worse. Vincent painted because painting was how he made sense of the world. The act of transforming what he saw into colour and form on canvas was necessary for him in a way that's hard to articulate. He needed to do it the way other people need to eat or sleep. The paintings were byproducts of that need, evidence of time spent doing the thing that kept him tethered to existence. Most of us will never create anything that endures for centuries. Our work will be forgotten, our contributions overlooked, our attempts at meaning-making lost in the noise of history. That's not tragic, it's just true. What matters is whether we do the work that feels necessary to us, regardless of whether anyone else values it. Whether we express our vision honestly, even when honesty brings no reward. Whether we keep going when everything suggests we should stop. Vincent kept going. Through rejection and poverty and illness and isolation, he kept painting. Not because he was certain it would matter, but because he wasn't certain it wouldn't. That small difference between giving up and continuing, between accepting defeat and making one more attempt, that's where everything happens. That's where the 2,000 paintings came from. One after another, accumulating until they became a body of work that changed how we see.